you miss me? I've been out of a comatose, but the depression.
Hello and welcome to Controlled Burns, the hobby list podcast from me, your host, Andrew Burns, or Slow Burn from Wildfire Gaming. And it's finally here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm finally going to regale you with the top 20 and thus the final version of my top 100 artists of all time. By the time that you're listening to this, that list should be public on the soundtrackonline.com, where you can also find it's one of the places you can find the backlog of episodes of Controlled Burns. But that is my personal website that I created all the way back around the time that I graduated from college. It's definitely been underused over the course of the years, but I always dreamed of actually having a top 100 artist list on there and having a top 500 song list, which will be an even bigger lift. And that's what I'm going to be working on throughout 2026. But for now, for the new year in 2025, my work on the top 100 artists is complete. So go check it out on the soundtrackonline.com if you want to be able to sort of just see it visually in a list and be able to read the essays. I am going to be mostly reading from the essays that I wrote as I go through today's episode, but in a more conversational manner. But if you want to just read them in that way, you can go do it on the soundtrackonline.com, and it's something that you'll be able to easily refer back to, of course, as well. I will continue to update the list more than likely, just because that's the way that my brain works. It's going to be kind of a living list, but today we're locking in what is sort of the final version for right now. And it's something that I have revised significantly since the last time that we spoke on this topic, because it's been a few months since I did the previous episodes. And so I'm going to quickly run through the top 80, or the bottom 80, I guess I should say, before we really get into the top 20. And if we get to any artists that I don't think that I've talked about on the podcast yet, I can think of one for sure. That's sort of in the meat of the list, then we'll stop and we'll discuss that artist. But that's kind of the plan for today's episode. So lock in and get ready for a discussion on who I think are the greatest musical artists of all time. If you're new, just a reminder that Controlled Burns is a hobby list podcast. We discuss things pop culture, music, video games, TV and film, books now as well to a degree. So if you're interested in those kind of things, you can follow and subscribe or wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you like the show and you want to write in, you can write in at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com. So let's get into the top of the list and let's just kind of run through, because like I said, you can refer back to the previous episodes to sort of talk about or to hear me talk about these artists in greater detail. But these we're going to quickly run through them just as a reminder for people, and then also just because there has been quite a bit of movement since last time we spoke. One artist has gotten actually kicked off the list, and so I just have them listed as an honorable mention, and that is The Cure. And then we get into the top 100 with Martin O'Donnell. Number 99 is Restless Heart. 98 is Green Sky Bluegrass. 97 is Camper Van Beethoven. 96 is Bon Iver. 95, J Mascis. 94, Jane's Addiction. 93, The Evening Rig. 92, Mitsudo Suzuki. 91, James Newton Howard. 90, M83. 89, Iggy and the Stooges. 88, Austin Wintory. 87, Yasunori Mitsuda. 86, Billy Joel. 85, Florence and the Machine. 84, Waxahachie. 83, Takeshi Hama. 82, Tadayoshi Makino. 81, Stephen Malkmus and the Jicks. 80, Bill Elm and Woody Jackson. 79, Darlene Love. 78, Julia Jacklin. 77, Atomic Tom. 76, Swearin'. 75, The Velvet Underground. 74, Ryan Adams. 73, Sharon Van Etten. 72, Robin. 71, Free Cake for Every Creature. 70, The Who. 69, Don Henley. 68, Brett Dennen. 67, Ashley McBryde. 66, The War on Drugs. 65, Adam Scorpa. 64, Michael Giacchino. 63, Melandrew. 62, Matthew Dennis. 61, Rosen. 60, Banner Pilot. 59, Junichi Masuda and Goichinos. 58, Metallica. 57, Gary Clark Jr. 56, Always. 55, Ashley Monroe. And the Pittslaney's kind of. 54, The National. 53, Better Oblivion Community Center. 52, Masayoshi Soken. 51, Madonna. 50, Tsukasa Saito. 49, Aerosmith. 48, Dr. Pez. 47, my cat is in the way. Out of the way, lady girl. 47, Brandy Carlisle. 46, Justin E. Bell. 45, Ben Howard. 44, Wilco. 43, Jeremy Sewell. 42, Rage Against the Machine. 41, Ken R. Gao. 40, Yoko Shimomura. And we're going to stop here at number 39 because number 39 is a new entry in the list, and that is Grace Park, who is also the front woman for The Deer. If you're going to actually listen to her music on Spotify, pretty much you're listening to The Deer, not Grace Park. So that you could also kind of put the Deer in this spot, but I put Grace Park in just because as the headliner, just because she's got some solo stuff that she did before she was with the Deer that I think is also laudable and therefore is worthy of being on this list under her own name. But just a little bit about Grace Park. She was one of the artists that I was exposed to as an opening act for John Craigie with my wife and her family. We're going to be talking a little bit more about John Craigie later today. My live experience with her was really special because actually I had my cousin Brett along for the ride on that one. So he was that was it's. I'm trying to think if there's even been another musical concert that I've seen with Brett other than Kiss. We went as kids. We went and saw Kiss one time, but anyway, he delivered one of the most immediately impressed reactions that I've ever seen as a witness to a new artist, and it's probably going to stick with me. Brett's one of those people where you can really tell what he's thinking whenever he's not interested in something. But as soon as Grace Park stepped on the stage and she started playing this piano, he was just really locked in for the entire performance. At times, his jaw was on the floor. He was just so starstruck by her, to the point where when we were able to talk to her a little bit after the show because she was out selling merch. And I had to convince him to ask her about one of the songs that she played because he was like looking for all the different songs in Spotify while when she played them, and there was one that he couldn't find, and it was because it's not under the Deer, it's under her own name, Grace Park, with on an album that she did with Sixo, who is I think now deceased. But so that performance really stuck with me over the last couple of years. But late last year, finally decided to actually dive in and really listen through the Deer's four major albums, which are On the Essence of the Indomitable Spirit, Tempest and Rapture, Do No Harm, and The Beautiful Undead. And there's not a single one of those albums that I would say is not great. A couple of them, Tempest and Rapture in particular, kind of climb up the ranks to being like really, really great, fantastic albums. Each album has its own standouts. I think their most popular song on Spotify is Confetti to the Hurricane from Do No Harm, and I kind of agree. I think that might be the best song that they've done, but there's Farther, which is this really great sort of dreamy acoustic song on their first album, on the Essence of the Indomitable Spirit. That was really great. Reflections on Moonstone Beach is my favorite song from Tempest and Rapture. I didn't like their most recent album, The Beautiful Undead, as much as the other three. It kind of dumbs down a little bit of Park's lyricism in favor of it seemed like they were kind of trying to do a little bit of hit chasing there. But the first song, Bellwether, is also an all timer. It's the first song on the album, and that's something that you'll notice if you go and listen to these albums, is that they really know how to start off albums with a bang. Like they always kind of seem to try to start off with their best song. So really great artist. I highly recommend him. I think pretty much anybody that listens to the Deer would probably enjoy it. So she's number 39 on this list, Grace Park and the Deer. Moving on to 38, Dead Mouse. 37, Ramin Djawadi. I never really know exactly how to say his name. He's a German guy. Game of Thrones composer. 56, Fleetwood Mac. 55, I'm sorry. 36 Fleetwood Mac, counting them myself, 35 Kiss, 34 Paul Simon and Simon and Garfunkel to a degree, 33 Catfish and the Bottlemen, 32 Hitomi Sato, 31 Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails, 30 Car Seat Headrest, 29 David Bowie, 28 Yutaka Yamada, 27 Velvet Revolver, 26 Muse, 25 Dave Matthews Band, 24 Marilyn Manson, 23 Bob Dylan, 22 Kanye West, and 21 is Black Sabbath. So that's my list up through number 21. And so today we're going to be talking about the top 20 in greater detail. And so to kick that off at number 20, um, we have Oasis. Actually, before we get into Oasis, I think we actually I was just took a second there to check my last list because I wanted to make sure that we actually hit everybody that is kind of in this upper portion of the 20s because stuff has moved around and actually we didn't. It looks like I think the one that we've missed is Bob Dylan, who I now have at 23. So he was in the top 20 last time I did the list, but he's moved down a couple spots, but still number 20, obviously one of the all-time greats. So I'm going to talk about him now before we get into the current top 20. So number 23 is Bob Dylan. So obviously few, if any, artists have had the impact, legacy, and really just sheer body of work that Bob Dylan has had over the course of his 60 plus year career, still active today, which is unbelievable. Kind of indisputably one of the greatest songwriters to ever live. His had this rapid development from being kind of like this world conscious folk singer in his early albums to one of the most iconic rock stars of the 60s. It was true evolution at the time, and his body of work really only progressed over the course of an incredible 40 studio albums, 21 live albums, and 17 volumes of bootlegs and other various recordings, to the point where there are probably a few people walking this earth that can say that they've heard it all, which is, of course, to say nothing of the man who created it all. So, and what's amazing too about Bob Dylan is the quality to quantity ratio across all that work is borderline unmatched. A litany of legendary songs and albums that were released over the course of, like I said, no less than 7 decades. This was a period in my life, or there was a period in my life where I probably would have put Bob Dylan at number one on this list, and I wouldn't bat an eye at someone who did that. I eventually got a little bit burned out on a lot of his sort of most iconic 60s work because I listened to them all the time when I was in college. But I still find myself drawn to a lot of his stuff, particularly some of the stuff that isn't quite as widely played as some of that 60s stuff. My favorite album by far is Blood on the Tracks. I think that's his best album and one of the greatest albums ever made. But other standout works for me from him, Highway 61 Revisited in terms of his 60 albums, I think is still my favorite. It's got a lot of it has like a Rolling Stone, which everybody knows, but it's got a lot of other kind of deeper cuts that are not super widely played that I think are all really, really great. And he had a really great session musician lineup working with him on that album. But I also really like his 78 album, Street Legal, which is one of his more overlooked albums, I would say. But it's got like these really great songs, Changing in the Guards, Where Are You Tonight? Dylan's kind of strangely melodic and almost commercial on that album, and I really really like it a lot. Really great music on it. And then I would say that you shouldn't overlook some of the more modern stuff that he's done over the last couple of decades either. Tempest is a really great album. I really have a lot of fondness for that album. It was the last, you know, well, I mean, he did that cover album a couple years after that where he covered some Sinatra songs, but Tempest was his last album of original works that came out while my grandfather was still alive, and my grandmother kind of had her wits about her, and we were able to sort of all listen to that album together and digest it together, and that was like right whenever I was starting college, and that's just a really fond memory that I have. So I'll always be kind of attached to that album. And then he did Rough and Rowdy Ways in 2020, which is very good, and it has a couple of really great songs, including I believe his longest song that he's ever done, which is Murder Most Foul, 17 minutes. And it's like this really deep examination of the assassination of John F. Kennedy and kind of its impact on the musical landscape that Dylan himself helped define in its wake. So obviously a legendary artist, Bob Dylan. And I wanted to make sure that I gave him his due here before we move on to the current top 20. So yeah, number 20, like I mentioned, is Oasis. They're a fascinating band for me because yeah, the public dispute between the two kind of leads, the brothers, Liam and Noel, um, kind of defined my understanding of them as their feud was really getting going around the time that I was first really getting into music with my first iPod and my subscription to Rolling Stone in late 2009. So I remember just reading about them a lot. And I was actually introduced to them a little bit before that through Guitar Hero. Guitar Hero World Tour had some might say from What's a Story Morning Glory, and I liked it a lot, but I didn't dive much deeper than that outside of just, you know, who they were with their sort of public personas. A little bit later, not too long after that, I listened to their debut album from 1994, Definitely Maybe, and that was an immediate connection, which has persisted to this day. I still can't think of very many albums that have standouts as prominent and plentiful as that album has. It's got Rock and Roll Star, Cigarettes and Alcohol, Columbia, Bring It On Down, Slide Away. They're all just like really some of the greatest rock songs ever made, and particularly coming out of that 90s era. Um, they did some later albums that were really great too. Morning Glory is held in honestly it seems like it's usually sort of held up as their best. And you know the fact that they came out just a year apart is very impressive. So you know to see them reunited now and sort of embarking on this world tour is I'd imagine a similar experience to what I felt you know back in like you know a decade ago when Guns N' Roses reunited. It's just a musical event that seemed very unlikely. And so you know that's really cool. And if it results in some new Oasis music, then the world stands to benefit. So that's really cool that they're back together. Number 19 is AC/DC. So I think if you've gone back and you've listened to my list and or you just sort of heard the wrap up right there, kind of leading into this discussion, I think it's pretty clear that 1970s hard rock was really my gateway into music appreciation and fandom. Aerosmith dominated that mix CD I've discussed that my dad made me that served as my first real introduction to the genre. But and AC/DC was not on that album, but that was only because he was literally scared that my mom would get pissed off if she heard me listening to it. But when it was just me and him, we were listening to some AC/DC. We had "Shook Me All Night Long" and "Back in Black" blasting. Probably, you know, while we were driving around, probably exactly as the AC/DC guys intended their music to be listened to. Um, my first AC/DC album that I actually owned was their live album from 1992. And that definitely helped foster a love for not only the band, but live albums, which persists with me to this day. I actually haven't gone back and listened to that album in a really long time. That would be an interesting experience. But my collection grew beyond there pretty quickly. I got High Voltage, which is their debut album, Highway to Hell, of course, and then of course Back in Black. And you know, both Highway to Hell and Back in Black, 1979 and 1980, you know, back-to-back releases. They were both at the time, especially when I first listened to them, I was like, man, these are some of the best albums I've ever heard. And I kind of do prefer Bon Scott's sort of more. He has a higher vocal range, I would say a clearer vocal range, and maybe a little bit more unhinged delivery than Brian Johnson does, which is who they got for Back in Black and has been with the band for the most part ever since then. But I do think that track for track, Back in Black is their best album. Even all these years later, I haven't managed to get sick of "You Shook Me All Night Long," which is crazy because I've heard that song so many times, like we all have. I know a lot of people have gotten sick of it, but I really haven't. I still think it's an amazing song, and I enjoy listening to it. Back in Black itself, the song, not so much. Like it's a great song, no doubt about it. It's an iconic piece of work, but it definitely like I never really need to hear that again. But "You Shook Me All Night Long," man, I just don't think I'm ever gonna get sick of that one. Um, but you know, even if you take both of those songs out, Back in Black is still an amazing album. It's got "Shoot to Thrill," it's got "Have a Drink on Me," which I think is just such a genius work and so brazen after you know Bon Scott's alcohol related death. So you know AC/DC, you know him, you love him, or you don't. You get what you get with AC/DC, but I'm a big fan. Number 18, I have Roger Waters. So not Pink Floyd, Roger Waters himself. So obviously, Pink Floyd does sort of factor in there. Like few rock acts of the 1970s have enjoyed the long-lasting cultural definition of Pink Floyd. They have just a fandom so massive and loyal that they're often ranked as some of the greatest fans. And certainly the Pink Floyd is ranked as one of the greatest artists of the 70s. They have a litany of great musical works to their name. They got Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall, Wish You Were Here. So it's a warranted status. Um, Roger Waters broke from the band. He's kind of a controversial guy. He broke from the band, kind of in an Axl Rose-esque move, sued the remaining members of the band for ownership of the Pink Floyd name. He lost out on that, and David Gilmour, the guitarist, sort of led a version of the group without him. That went on to have some success even after Roger Waters departed. But um, what's amazing is that to me, Roger Waters' greatest musical triumph was not with Pink Floyd. It was 2017 and his album Is This the Life We Really Want? It's a very strong and stark anti-fascist album that was clearly written in response to the election of Donald Trump the first time. And unfortunately, it's very relevant today, and probably even more so than it was when it first released, 9 years ago. Uh, but regardless of like the message, it's just a musical tour de force as well. It's not unlike, musically, it's not unlike some of Pink Floyd's greatest works, but it just has a more overt political edge to it. For the opener is my favorite. It's openly sacrilegious, but uh, really, really lyrically and musically strong. It's a song called Deja Vu. And then he goes on to do Picture That, and there's this anti-war protest called Bird in a Gale, which really sounds very Pink Floyd-esque. The album is a really dark album throughout the majority of its runtime. It's got iconography highlighting drowning children, which was like a real event that he's talking about there, and unprovoked drone strikes on civilians, which of course is what has been widespread over the last couple decades. But um, interestingly, its last sort of movement, it's really like a medley of a few songs there at the end, almost Abbey Road-esque, is really talking about sort of the beauty of love and its ability to withstand the worst that the world has to offer, which is really hits home after you listen to all the dark stuff that he's talking about leading up to that. So to me, that album is a masterpiece for all time. I think it's better than any album released in like the 40 years leading up to it. I've never heard an album from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, or even 2010s that I would say is better than Is This the Life We Really Want? I mean, it is truly, I think, just a brilliant piece of art. Um, and really, that alone would be enough to put Roger Waters as high as he is on this list. And then you factor in, of course, all the Pink Floyd stuff that he did, and it's clear that he's just one of the all-time greatest contributors to music that we've ever had. So I've got him at number 18 on this list. Okay, number 17 is another legendary band, the Rolling Stones. So, when I think about the Rolling Stones these days, my wife and I actually have an ongoing joke where when a Rolling Stones song comes on, I remind her that Mick Jagger is British because he never sounds British at all. Uh, whenever he's singing, because they're kind of going for that sort of Southern blues sort of sound. And she obviously recognizes that now, but she literally couldn't believe it whenever I first told her about that. And that was her, she never really was exposed to the Rolling Stones before she met me. So, it's kind of a funny anecdote, but they are without doubt, one of the most legendary pieces of, maybe in my opinion, the greatest piece of the British invasion of the 60s and 70s. I know a lot of people pick the Beatles, but if you look at how good the music is, not so much influence, but just like how good the music that they made is, I don't think it's even close. And the Stones definitely took a different approach because they were like I said, they were definitely dedicated to replicating and kind of modernizing the roots-based blues acts of the Southern United States, like Muddy Waters and Robert Johnson. Um, some of the Stones' best work, I would say, takes cues from those early revolutionaries, but really it's Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the core duo, along with just a litany of other legendary instrumentalists like Bill Wyman, Charlie Watts, Mick Taylor. Um, the final evolution of the sound that those guys created together they've taken it to heights that few bands have ever reached. In particular, the band's output around the turn of the decade from the 60s to the 70s is really, really legendary stuff. You had kind of the dark Vietnam era overtones of 1969's Let It Bleed. Then you go into the down and dirty, just sort of hard blues sound of 1971's Sticky Fingers. And then, of course, in 1972, they had the double album Exile on Main Street, which, I think all three of those albums you see held up as their best, depending on who you talk to. Um, and it's kind of across at these three albums that the band's creative peak was reached. A lot of their best songs came out from those three albums, like You Can't Always Get What You Want and Give Me Shelter and Dead Flowers and Loving Cup and Tumbling Dice. And what's amazing about that is that you could take to me all those songs are like among the greatest songs ever written. But then you find any other Stones fan and they could argue the same for just a completely different lineup of tracks from those albums because the different songs on those albums speak to different people. So and they're all like so strong throughout. So those that's definitely like the peak of their career. But obviously, consider they've been around since the '60s and they've pretty consistently released music over the course of the time since then. So they have some other classics to their name as well. I really like Beast of Burden from Some Girls from 1978, and Worried About You from 1981's Tattoo You. And then I really love Plundered My Soul, which is this outtake from the Exile era, and they released that for the first time in 2010. Which like I said, 2010 that was a big year for me, as we've discussed ad nauseum here. So it was a big one for me hearing that song. But countless rock bands have taken cues from the Rolling Stones since they first came out of the scene in the early to mid 60s. But I would say the few have ever matched their sheer quantity and quality of great music. Number 16 is U2. And, with U2, we got to tell a little bit of a story. So there have been plenty, believe me, plenty of instances where my opinion has been out of step with where the majority is in the United States. But I don't know if it's ever been more true than when U2 pulled one of the most widely despised publicity moves in history when they gave away their 2014 album Songs of Innocence for free to every iTunes user in the country. Seems like the vast majority of people were insulted by this gift. So brazen. And what's funny is when that happened, when they did that, it was like on a Sunday night. And I was literally on my way back. I was driving back to my college dorm. Probably had been with my grandparents, hanging out with them, fully expecting to when I was like, when I get back to my dorm, I'm going to go on iTunes and I'm going to buy that album. And that was literally my plan. And I got back to the dorm. I opened my laptop. I was going to go buy the album, and it showed up as purchased. And I was like, that is so strange. I was like, there must be some sort of glitch on iTunes because this is this new album from this huge band that I really wanted to buy and listen to, and I don't even have to buy it. It's just all here. And so I went to bed thinking that I was just the beneficiary of this some weird glitch. And then I woke up and you know people were lighting their freaking houses on fire, furious that Bono and U2 had given them a free album. And that was just a very memorable sequence for me in my life at college. I remember writing about that experience at the newspaper at the time that I was the editor of at the East Texan. But Songs of Innocence was not my first introduction to the band. But it was just one of yet another touchstone with them that I've had over the years, which really goes back to some of my earliest days of music fandom in 2009. Like I said, 2009, 2010, big years for me. 2009, they did No Line on the Horizon, and I definitely remember listening to some stuff from that. And then also Once from Octung Baby was one that was an early one that I really enjoyed. But of course, later I became introduced to their true masterwork, which is 1987's The Joshua Tree. I really think it is almost objectively just one of the greatest albums of all time. I recently saw a viral tweet going around, kind of asking people to consider what's the greatest consecutive three-track run on an album in music history. Ultimately, I arrived on Candy's Room, Racing in the Street, and The Promised Land from Darkness on the Edge of Town, Bruce Springsteen. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. But I have to say, and I saw other people saying this, and I was like, that is a solid contender. From the Joshua Tree, you had Where the Streets Have No Name, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, and With or Without You as tracks 2 through 4, I think, of that album. that definitely makes a compelling case. That is a ridiculously strong lineup of songs packed into the first half of that album. Another kind of story before I leave you on U2 is my mom was actually a big, whenever I was growing up, we were listening to much Christian music. But whenever she was in the 80s, living through the 80s in high school, that she and her friends, her boyfriend at the time, went to a lot of concerts. And U2 was obviously very big at that time. I think she graduated the same year that the Joshua Tree was released, but she said that U2 was actually the only band that they weren't able to get tickets to because they sold out in literal seconds. And she said at the time, she was like, I don't even, that was fine. I don't even know. I didn't really understand the hype behind them. But, you ask me decades later, almost half a century later, I don't think that their hype it could be more justified, failed publicity stunts or not. So number 16 is U2. Okay, number 15, I have the Smashing Pumpkins. This is another one where I was kind of familiar with the Smashing Pumpkins or sort of got introduced to them through video games. They had Today in Guitar Hero World Tour, which I really enjoyed. And then, of course, they had 1979 in Grand Theft Auto 4, which was really, I mean, I was blown away by that song when I first heard it in that game. But I really associate I think my true entry point to fandom with them was when I moved across the country from, kind of where I was born and raised in Northeast Texas and also where I live now, to Princeton, New Jersey in December 2019. I took a life-changing job with NPM, which is still where I work. But at the time, we were going to all work out of an office in New Jersey, and we did. So we don't have to get into all that. But point is, I was moving across the country. It was a really huge move for me, made huge development in my life. And it turns out you have a lot of time to kill when you're on a massive drive like that. I think it was like a 21 to 22 hour drive. And so I spent a pretty sizable chunk of that listening to new albums that I had never given a chance before. And two of them were the Smashing Pumpkins' probably biggest classics. You had 1993 Siamese Dream, and then of course their epic sort of two disc follow up, Melancholy and The Infinite Sadness. And needless to say, I immediately fell in love with both of those albums and just the band in general. And I when I think about my earliest days in New Jersey, I was definitely riding around listening to a lot of Billy Corgan and the Smashing Pumpkins. So 6 years later, coming up on 7 years. Well, no, it's really 6 years. Both albums, I would say, still hit very hard for me. I love them. They're filled to the brim with various renditions of the two. The group has two great tricks that they do on both of these albums. They have like these over the top angst filled tenderness and like achingly beautiful ballads like Mayonnaise and By Starlight. And then they have like balls to the wall angst filled rockers like An Ode to No One and Geek USA. And I often there's another kind of joke I have with my wife where I'm like the band has two speeds and they're really good at both of them, and it's those two speeds. But those I would say most of my favorite songs from the band are from those two albums. But uh, it's they have a lot of great stuff that they've really never stopped releasing music, and I would say even their modern stuff is really quite strong. And their most recent release from 2024 was a Gory Mori May, and it has plenty to love. It's got War Dreams of Itself, Who Goes There, Eden, all of them feel like they would have been just as home in their 90s heyday. So really love the Smashing Pumpkins. They really hit for me. Number 14, we have Radiohead. My introduction to Radiohead, which really they're maybe the greatest and most influential active rock act that was active at the turn of the century. Um, Sort of came in an unlikely place. So once again, skewed by my entry into music fandom around 2010. My entry point to Radiohead was the first album they released during that time, which was 2011's The King of Limbs, which is, perhaps one of their most overlooked albums that they've ever released. That is not filled with hits, we could say. But what's wild is even having missed all of the greatest work leading up to that point, I was still all the way in just based on the King of Limbs. The King of Limbs really connected with me. I never heard anything that sounded even remotely like that, and I just kind of found it fascinating, I guess. And I don't really listen to King of the Limbs today because since then I've of course gone back into their catalog and become a fan of their actual greatest works. And they kind of had this unbeatable stretch in the latter half of the '90s, leading into the turn of the century, from the Bends through OK Computer, and then of course Kid A in 2000, which is, again, one of the greatest runs of albums from any act of all time. All three of them have been my favorites from them at various points in my life. Um, Today, my favorite is OK Computer. I think OK Computer is going to be tough to beat um, going forward. I think it's the most consistent of their albums, and it also has the highest highs. Like Climbing Up the Walls, I think is just literal genius, and Let Down is another one that I think is an all-time great. And then Paranoid Android, of course, which is probably the biggest hit on the album. It's huge and like a just very dynamic song. But then again, when I look back to where I was in high school, Kid A was my favorite. I just thought it was so hypnotic and it just really I really connected with that album. And then in college, like the kind of overbearing sadness of much of the Bends is what was connected with, what I connected with. And so that was my favorite from them at that time. So and I think that's kind of part of what makes Radiohead so brilliant. It's like regardless of where you are in your life, they have something in their catalog that's going to speak to you like few records can. And that's an achievement that they've proven out more consistently than just about anyone else over the course of the full breadth of my personal musical experience. So obviously, I have a lot of fondness for them, and they are number 14 on this list. Okay, number 13, we have Kendrick Lamar, which is, got a lot to say about him. So, uh, a lot is one thing that is really interesting to me is a lot has changed in just the rap genre. I feel since Kendrick Lamar kind of burst on the mainstream scene, at least in 2012 with Good Kid, Mad City, and it just had these sort of inescapable hits at that time. Bitch Don't Kill My Vibe, and then Swimming Pool Strength was another one. That was actually the first song I heard from him. Um, but like since that time, it's just like so much has changed. We've had the collapse of Kanye West and Drake, the latter of which was kind of at the hands of Kendrick himself. We had the rise and fall of like these different subgenres of rap, like trap and mumble rap, and now I feel that we're having what is a pretty clear fall off of hip hop's dominance in the mainstream music scene in favor of, the kind of more widely palatable pop acts like what you would have seen in like the 90s. Like, we have like The Weeknd and Bruno Mars and Ed Sheeran, those that are like really chopping the tarts. And then, you have like the kind of the girl pop champions like Taylor Swift and Sabrina Carpenter and Ariana Grande. And it's like these are really the biggest and most successful artists today, not so much the rap stuff, which I was growing up when I was a kid, and especially when I was in like high school, middle school, and high school, it was like rap music was everything. So it's just really interesting to kind of see how that genre has kind of fallen off, and even like with Kendrick, I feel like over the last decade, as the genre has sort of fallen. Um, he himself feels like he's kind of been chasing his own success, which was, of course, 2015. He released his magnum opus, "To Pimp a Butterfly," which is a concept album that's so grand in its ambitions and beloved by critics and me that going back to quote unquote regular music from the albums he's released since then, which of course are Damn, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and G and X, has kind of felt like a step back, but then at the same time, he's never been hotter as a mainstream act. Last year he did had his big Super Bowl victory lap following his massacre of Drake's public reception, and it's definitely the most one-sided rap beef that I can remember. When all is said and done, and Not Like Us had conquered the charts and kind of the mind share of America. I mean, that was a boy. That was the end of that. But even as the genre has kind of fallen around him, Lamar has and I have been listening to a lot less rap music too. It's certainly modern rap music. He's continued to build out, uh, far more than his fair share of just really brilliant tracks over the last decade. Damn has this mind-bending song called Lust that I think is genius. Damn is a really great album. It's not To Pimp a Butterfly level, but it's really, really strong. And then Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers has N95, which I think is just one of the most triumphant rap songs of all time. I really love it. It's a really great running song. And then Euphoria, which was he just releases a single as part of the Drake beef, is my vote for greatest diss track. Far and above, even over Not Like Us. It's not as catchy, but I think it's a deeper song and better musically. But looking back on Kendrick, I mean, hit making beginnings, all-time great LPs, modern chart dominance. That's kind of been his trajectory, and through it all, he's remained a consistent star to kind of pull for the last decade and a half. And running circles around everyone else in the genre doesn't hurt. So Kendrick Lamar, my favorite rap artist of all time, and certainly my favorite rap artist of today by a wide margin. Okay, number 12, I feel like we've been doing a lot of like really popular artists here and the like kind of the teens here, but number 12, we're going to another very slow burny pick. Number 12 is TPR, the pianist. So, kind of I like sort of regaling you with my history of some of these artists, and obviously I must have some pretty big history with TPR to have him this high on the list. For me, I would say it's rare to listen to an artist and then just as you're listening to him, just immediately recognize like, okay, this is a life changing event. And I struggle to think of a single artist where I recognize that as immediately as I did when I first discovered TPR years ago. I remember I was sitting in my grandparents' living room, had my headphones on. My brother Brandon and my cousin Brett were kind of laughing, and they were all talking about Final Fantasy VII, which we'd all just sort of recently played for the first time. It was all of our favorite games. And I was literally at that time I was hunting for Final Fantasy music on Spotify. This was before Square Enix had added all the main soundtracks to the service, which they have since done, and now you can listen to all the originals from the Final Fantasy games. But um, I discovered TPR while I was doing that, and it's particularly this album he did, Final Heaven, melancholy music from Final Fantasy VII. And there's actually done two versions of it. I by the time I discovered him, he had already done the expanded version. And that starts with a version of the Genova theme, which is, that's not surprising. I listened to that, I was like, wow, this is great. But it's like, that's not surprising. The Genova theme, it's very easy to make that sound great. Then it skipped ahead to, I saw Rufus Welcoming Ceremony was on that album. And I was like, all right, well, let's listen to his rendition of Rufus Welcoming Ceremony, which is, kind of just a joke track in the original context of Final Fantasy VII. It's kind of a silly little song. And then when I listened to it and I realized that he made even that sound like a, Final Fantasy X Xanarkand level classic, I was like, okay, I've discovered something special. And so ever since then, TPR has been a mainstay in my consistent rotation on Spotify. I actually don't know if there's been a single Spotify wrap up that I've had since then without him being in at least my top five artists. More often than not, he's my number one artist of the year. Part of that is because I listen to a lot of his music while I do other things, like whenever I'm working, or there was a period when I was playing Skyrim and doing that with TPR music instead of Skyrim music, and that was really cool. Um, his greatest trick is definitely his arrangements, his piano arrangements of Final Fantasy music. Um, and that's kind of the basis for my love of his work. But I will say pretty much everything else that he touches also turns to gold. That includes some brilliant renditions of Koji Kondo classics from Super Mario 64 and the Legend of Zelda series. Um, and honestly, I think maybe his greatest achievement is his rendition of another throwaway track called Global Terminal, which was written by Hitomi Sato, who we talked about earlier on this list for Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Um, and it's like he like sort of transforms it from sort of like a digitized cacophony um, from in its original context in the game to this Pixar-esque piano-laden masterpiece that is like pushed over the top by this accompanist he had on that song called "The Clarinetist," which is a ridiculous name, but uh, you can't really understand what I'm saying unless you actually listen to it. So if you need to pause this, whatever, go listen to Global Terminal, and then come back and tell me that it doesn't sound like it would be played under like the most affecting Pixar sequence that you've ever seen. Up meets Soul. And so like just that it's just unbelievable that he was able to do that, especially if you go back and listen to what the original song sounded like. It's just like so different. And so he may seem high on this list, rubbing shoulders with all-time greats given his status primarily as an arranger rather than a composer, although he does have some original compositions to his name as well. But for me, just the number of great works that he has maximized, you know, the best versions of these songs possible are his work. Really just kind of runs circles around the output of just about anyone else. And so for that reason, TPR, I got to give him credit as number 12 on this list. Okay, number 11, we have Bob Seger. And what's interesting about Bob Seger is, and my relationship with Bob Seger, is there's probably no artist actually with a longer tenure in my life than Bob Seger. And yet it took me until last year to actually listen to one of his albums all the way through. So my earliest musical memory is of listening to Bob Seger's Old Time Rock and Roll with my grandfather. And there was like this funny thing that where he had this big setup where it was a record player, but it was also a CD player and a cassette player. It was like this huge, like kind of towering setup that he had. And when we listened to Old Time Rock and Roll for the first time, he had this blue record on his record player. Now, that's not what we were listening to. We were listening to Bob Seger's Greatest Hits on CD. But I associated it with that blue record, and I was like, anytime we listened to it, I was like, well, you got to have the blue record on there. He's like, no, 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 you really don't, because it's not that's not what was playing the music. And I was like, no, 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 you have to have the blue record on there. I think it might have been like Joe Satriani or something crazy like that. But anyway, so we kind of had that thing where we always put the blue record on there, even though it really didn't have anything to do with Bob Seger. Um, and then recently, also, my stepdad sent me a lot of sort of home footage that he had captured over the course of my life, and there's some really early footage that's me sleeping with a Seeger record like under my arm, asleep on the floor, like covered up, and We've Got Tonight is like playing in the background, which is it's hilarious, and like I don't even remember that, or being a fan of that song as a kid, but that's like such a hilarious image. Reagan said that if I ever became like a rock star or something, that would be like an image that would be shared. But these were not tracks that followed me into adulthood. I wasn't really inspired to dive into his discography in any major way for many years. It was he was just kind of was not forgotten, but just left behind until 2025 when my cousin Brett mentioned he was like I remember he just randomly texted me one day and he was like, Bob Seger, man, what a guy. And I was like, yeah, gotta love Bob Seger. And I was like, when I started working on this list, I was like, Bob Seger probably should be on this list, but because just from being exposed to various things here and there that he had done. But I was like, without really diving into his discography, it's hard for me it'd be impossible for me to determine how high he should be on the list. So that is exactly what I did, and I actually listened to all 12 of the albums that Bob Seger currently has on Spotify in 2025, and that includes two live albums. So that was a really fascinating experience. His commercial breakthrough was one of those live albums called Live Bullet in 1976, and it makes sense because the energy that he and the Silver Bullet Band brings to that set makes for an exhilarating listen, even now. And easily ranks among the greatest live albums that I've ever heard. And all of his studio albums, like I said, I listened to 10 of them. They're all at least solid, but they range a bit in terms of quality. I guess that first one, his first album, I would say is not solid. It's pretty rough. But Spotify has all these gaps in his discography. Like not all of his albums are on Spotify, so it goes straight from that 1969 album to which has Ramblin' Gambling Man on it. It might actually be the name of the album. To the next one is Beautiful Loser from 1975. Actually, now that I look at it, I see that there's something else that they put on there that I haven't listened to from 1966. It says Heavy Music, the complete cameo recordings for Bob Seger. It's only 25 minutes long, 10 songs. So I don't know what that is, but that was not there whenever I was doing my Bob Seger marathon late last year. But yeah, it goes from 1969's Ramblin' Gambling Man to 1975's Beautiful Loser. So obviously you're missing out on a decent chunk of his like all of his early 70s work. But it kind of might work out fine that way because Live Bullet is where he really, which is what he did after Beautiful Loser, is where he really hit it big. And Beautiful Loser was kind of the beginning, from what I understand, of his kind of more soft rock direction, which is definitely what I think he's best at, and the reason that I really like him so much. So after Rambling Gambling Man, which I think is a pretty bad album, his studio albums are at least solid, and they range a bit in terms of quality. Like Night Moves, the song, stands out as I think his best work. It's his best single, and I think it's just one of the all-time greatest songs ever written. It's just kind of a bit of genius. But the album itself, I was like, well, he wrote Night Moves, and there's not a ton else on that album that really sticks out to me. Whereas the follow-up to that album, 1978 Stranger in Town, I think it stands out as one of his best albums, like just a phenomenal album, filled to the brim with classics. It's got Hollywood Nights, Still the Same, Old Time Rock and Roll, We've Got Tonight, all huge hits. And then rubbing shoulders with some of, I would say, some of his best underrated gems like Brave Strangers and Till It Shines, and especially the famous Final Scene, which I think is maybe his greatest sort of heartbroken power ballad. And when it comes to Bob Seger, the competition is steep for that title. So that I really love that song. And, I think his 70s output is kind of generally regarded as his best, which makes sense. But really, 1986's Like a Rock is not far behind his greatest works, and I think actually surpasses many of his 70s albums. It may not have been a big commercial winner for him, but there's obviously the title track, which was a hit, and then beyond that, there's so many great songs on there, like American Storm and Miami and The Ring and Tightrope and It's You. They're all just really, really great tracks. Some of them I would put among the greatest songs ever written. Um, and that was kind of that 86 album I felt like was kind of, at least as far as what I was able to listen to on Spotify, was kind of the the last big hurrah for him, but you do not want to overlook The Fire Inside. The album itself is, solid, but not anything to really write home about. But the title track, The Fire Inside, which actually utilizes the E Street Band's legendary Roy Battan for on piano, is like an awesome, awesome song. Like his greatest probably since Night Moves. Like it is just a brilliant piece of work. So you definitely listen to that song at least. And if you want to know what albums to really hit, to really understand what's so great about Bob Seger, I definitely recommend Live Bullet. I recommend Stranger in Town. I recommend Like a Rock. Those are three just truly, truly fantastic albums front to back. And you'll start to understand why Bob Seger was so popular, and that he's another one of those guys where it's like I don't know how you can really listen to Bob Seger and not enjoy it, which I think is really I think kind of true for my number 10 on this list as well. And it sounds like a lot of people do listen to them and enjoy it, and that is Coldplay. Now, Coldplay is kind of an interesting one here. I'm not gonna read my essay that I wrote on Coldplay because I read that I believe on the last episode that we talked about him, because Coldplay was significantly lower down the list. If they were in the mid to upper 20s. Let me see if I can find out, verify that I did that. So yeah, I did Coldplay on that last one. But since then, so I haven't really changed the essay because it still rings true. Everything that I wrote there, I think is still accurate. But um, what happened with Coldplay is I was kind of after the Bob Seger thing, I was like, well, I really enjoyed that experience of just sort of just listening through everything that this guy has to offer, and just really getting a full and complete look at this singular artist. And that's just kind of how my brain works. I've always been, not always, but I've learned that I'm about myself over the last decade or so, that I'm a completionist, and so it's very satisfying for me to just listen to everything that someone's done. Some artists, it's not super viable, like Bob Dylan, for instance. We were talking about, he has like literally freaking 100 releases, so it's like, geez, better devote a year to listen to everything that he has if you're gonna go that route. But um, with some artists like Bob Seger, and I did it with another artist that we're going to talk about here in a minute. I enjoyed, and the Deer, which we discussed earlier today. I just enjoyed just sort of starting at their first album, listening through everything they had to have on Spotify, and it's like, well, now I know what this artist has to offer. I think it'd be interesting to do that with a lot of different artists on this list. But number 10 is which is Coldplay. That's another one where I had a lot of my basically where they were on the list, but previously in sort of like the mid to upper 20s. That was kind of based off of my memories of their earliest work, their first four or five albums or so. And then I had listened to Moon Music, which was their 2024 release. But there was a gap there of albums that I had never listened to. And I decided that, you know what, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to listen to them all. It's like 10 albums or so. And I was like, I'm going to re-listen to those older Coldplay albums that I haven't listened to in a long time, like, your X and Y and your um, Rush of Blood to the Head and stuff like that. And then I'm gonna go and listen to the new stuff or the newer stuff that I had never listened to, the stuff that came out before Moon Music. And I was really kind of amazed by that experience. And it just made me realize how consistently strong that band has been across their entire career, and how they really, I don't think that there's a bad Coldplay song, which is amazing to say for a group that's been around as long as they have, 25-year career, and just how much that their sound has evolved over the course of that time as well. I've just been very impressed by that. That's always very impressive to me with artists. We're gonna talk about that with several of the artists still to come here on this list. That just continued evolution and sort of remaking yourself. Uh, I think is a really laudable trait, and I think that Coldplay has done that more than a lot of artists and more than a lot of people realize. I was surprised at what my favorite album from them was, which was Viva La Vida from 2008. Because I always kind of looked at that album as like, yeah, it was good, but it was a step down from X and Y and A Rush of Blood to the Head. And I think it was kind of received that way. But um, actually, I was really impressed by that album. It has a lot of sort of longer, almost movement type, Black Sabbath or Green Day esque approaches to music, where it's like they kind of have like two or three songs in one, and the track evolves over the course of that time. So the longer tracks, and I really appreciate that approach to songwriting, and so I really enjoyed that. And then I was really surprised by some of the more modern stuff. Music of the Spheres from 2021, which is like kind of a spacey album. It's what they did before Moon Music, and it has some similarities, but definitely a lot more of a space theme. And there's like all these different album or different plans on the album, and it's like what I learned listening through it on Spotify is like each one of them sort of corresponds to a different song. And I thought that was really, really cool. Of course, we all know Rush of Blood to the Head is brilliant. We all know X and Y is brilliant. We don't have to really dig into that too much. Everyday Life was another one from Coldplay that was really interesting to me. This was an album that I don't know if I'd ever even heard of Everyday Life. And it was such a departure for them because it was like a lot more serious of an album, I would say. Like it definitely had some pretty deep themes of like loss and death and some political stuff in there as well, which I was like, wow, I can't believe that Coldplay has a political bone in their body. So that was really encouraging and interesting to listen to. And also just it was a very extremely diverse album. They were taking a lot of a very clearly very different inspirations into it, like worldly inspirations into it, which was really really cool to hear. And also my favorite song that I've ever heard from Coldplay, and really it's become one of my favorite songs that I've ever heard in my life, called Daddy. Um, from that album, I think actually, well, it's the third biggest hit off of that album behind Orphans and Everyday Life, but it really hit. I was not ready for that. I was really surprised by that. It's just piano and Chris Martin vocals. But wow, it really hits hard for, we don't have to get too deep into it, but just it as like a yearning for like this connection with a father figure that has sort of abandoned the person in the song is really deep, kind of a really deep song for me. So that was a um really impressed by that. And then even some of the stuff that I wouldn't put as high as that, like your ghost stories, for instance, was one that I would put, pretty low in terms of their discography. But that was a really cool album that I never heard of either, that I really enjoyed as well. And it was like clearly, as soon as I listened to it, I was like, okay, Chris Martin, this is a divorce album. And it was just like very clear because I've heard, some divorce albums in my day, like Blood on the Tracks from Bob Dylan and Tunnel of Love from Bruce Springsteen. As soon as it starts, like, okay, this is a divorce album. But a really well done divorce album, and it really pares down the soundscape of Coldplay to be very, kind of reminds me a little bit of 808s and Heartbreak from Kanye West, where it's like very minimalist, but really strong stuff in there in that album, particularly like in the middle of the album. I thought was very very strong. So yeah, I there's not a single, like, the worst Coldplay album was A Head Full of Dreams from 2015. It just kind of felt like a worse version of Moon Music, super like that was where they really went into their kind of modern phase, where it's like super anthemic and very tend to be very inspirational and upbeat and everything, and it does that well, but not as well as Moon Music, but still like I was surprised by the variety that happened before that and after that actually, because after that they did Everyday Life and Music of the Spheres, which are two very different sounding albums. So yeah, I was really impressed by Coldplay going back and listening to them in that context. And now they are truly, here they are at number 10 on my favorite artists of all time. And kind of what prompted that was I was just been kind of tickled ever since I learned about it, which I talked about it last time, that they are by far the most listened to and popular band on Spotify. They're not the number one artist, but they're always in the top 10 artists in overall, and they're the number one band. And I've always just been so fascinated by that ever since I learned. It's like, really, Coldplay, that's so crazy. I just kind of associated them with, being big when I was a kid, but clearly their output has never really slowed over the course of that time, and they've always been putting out consistently strong music and consistently diverse music. And so for that reason, I have such a newfound appreciation for Coldplay, and that's why they're number 10 on this list. Okay, number 9, we have John Craigie. This is the a big entry for my wife and her family. So, talking about some of the artists that I've talked to already on this list. Obviously, I'm a big fan of the artists that we've discussed here today. But I don't think I had ever really seen the true depth of fandom until I met my wife and learned of her family's obsession. And yes, I call it an obsession with John Craigie, who's a singer-songwriter that's been around for, I don't even know, 15 years or so. And, I was actually asking my wife when I was sort of writing my essay on John Craigie. I was like, how many times do you think you've seen John Craigie live? She has lost count. She doesn't know. She literally has no idea how many times she's seen this guy live. That's how many times they have been to see him. Her best guess is between 10 to 15. It's like, he's been the artist that I've seen the most live. And guess what? I'm about to go see him live again this week with her family yet again. And it's like I'm sorry, I've seen him 3 times, but it's getting to the point where it's like, man, I could see myself losing track too before it gets out of hand. Like this is a guy that I never didn't even know existed 5 years ago, and now here I am about to go see him for a fourth time. And that's just by virtue of how big of a fan her family is. Um, like you can't even go over to either of my in-laws' residences without hearing some John Craigie. It's just impossible. Or you can't get in a car with them without hearing some John Craigie, and it's crazy. And I struggle a little bit to understand why this one guy has captivated them to that level of degree where they kind of rarely choose to listen to anything else. But I have to admit that from the first time that I heard him on opening for Steinbeck, his 2018 live album, during my 3 day long first date with my wife in February 2021, I was sold on him from then. It's a fantastic album, and it mixes kind of this brand of humorous storytelling that he mixes in between his songs on his live albums with just the right amount of earnestness on songs like Dissect the Bird and Politics, on songs like Presidential Silver Lining and Silliness, on songs like Michael Collins and Romance, and songs like Westbound Bart, and then just plain old brilliant songwriting like on Resurrection Bay. So that album, opening for Steinbeck, is my favorite of his albums to this day. However, I'd say if I'm going sort of more on a more objective basis, I think No Rain, No Rose, which is a studio album he did, it might be his best. It's got the title track "No Rain No Rose," which is truly a great song, and his greatest hit, "I Am California," which I don't like quite as much, but it's a good song. Is on that album as well. It's got a lot of other great songs as well, and some very interesting cover of "Tumbling Dice" from the Rolling Stones, which is unique. I didn't expect to see that on a John Craigie album. So that might be his best. He has another live album that came out very recently called Greatest Hits. Just kidding, live, no hits, because he's always kind of putting himself down, self-deprecating. That is almost as good as opening for Steinbeck. Really, really strong. It's got this central hook of a song called Mallory. But I think his greatest track that he's ever done is Perseids, which is very Lou Reed-esque. And that is actually from Mermaid Salt, which was a studio album he did in, I think, 2021. So that, pretty good variety there. His live albums kind of all follow the same general formula, but for his studio albums, I really respect him for, again, kind of constantly expanding and evolving his sound over the course of his studio efforts. He's got a New Orleans jazz inspired album, The Apocalypse is Over. He's got this more expressive No Rain No Rose I mentioned earlier. He's got this rambunctious Pagan Church album he did recently alongside TK and the Holy Know Nothings. But the center of all of his work is just Craigie himself and his penchant for mixing endearing stories with great songwriting. And obviously it's a winning formula. I've come to love him as well. I wouldn't put him as the number one. I wouldn't devote my life to his fandom, but I do really enjoy John Craigie, and I think he's one of the greatest songwriters that I've ever heard. And so he's number 9 on this list. Okay, number 8 is another one of the artists that I did a kind of marathon listening session with all of their works last year. Not that it was a very hard one to do because they haven't done very many albums, but number 8 is LCD Sound System, which is a really interesting one for me because my fandom with LCD Sound System kind of is a story of lost time, which is kind of poetic actually, considering the trajectory and lyricism of a lot of their best work. But um, I discovered them through Losing My Edge, which was their first big single. It came out in 2005. I was exposed to it, of course, more like 2009, 2010. So I kind of had a similar starting point as a lot of other people. Um, yeah, believe me, that song is an acquired taste, and as all of LCD Sound System's music is really. But it was a taste that I did acquire, but it was not one that I acquired to the degree where I moved on to actually investigate the band's other work. Even though when I listened to All My Friends from Sound of Silver, I was like, wow, this is one of the greatest songs I've ever heard. And I still didn't, like, for some reason, listen to that full album. And it wasn't until their comeback album that released in 2017, American Dream, that I listened to, which I listened to all the way through at that time. And that was the first time I'd listened to a full LCD Sound System album. I really liked it immediately, but it kind of fell out of my rotation. And so, I decided again because of this list, I was like, all right, I'm gonna go back and listen to LCD Sound System and kind of really figure, clue they should be on the list. Let me figure out exactly where they should be on the list. And so I actually started with American Dream, and I went back and listened to it. I was like, okay, yeah, this album is brilliant, and they definitely need to be on the list. Now I need to go back and listen to the stuff that I haven't heard before, which is their first 3 albums. And so they did the self-titled debut in 2005, they did the Sound of Silver in 2007, and they did This Is Happening in 2010, which I was really surprised that I didn't listen to it in 2010, considering all the stuff that I was listening to. I will say that that initial album is, I would characterize it as an enjoyable mess. The band was clearly more focused on delivering like kind of catchy hooks, kind of club bangers, rather than like they didn't really have a lot of songwriting or any songwriting depth to really back that up. But that changed very quickly with The Sound of Silver, which ever since I listened to it has immediately shot up my list of the greatest albums I've ever heard. It is an amazing, amazing album, front to back. It is just absolutely brilliant. And surprisingly, This Is Happening, which came out in 2010, is not super far behind. And it's got some genius bits of songwriting in there as well. You wanted a hit, all I want, I can change, and it kind of really dials in on that sort of sardonic wit that now defines the group and definitely defines American Dream. But even after listening to all that stuff, maybe my biggest hot take is that I actually still think American Dream is the best one out of the 4. I think it just edges out the Sound of Silver. It's close, but I think it just edges out Sound of Silver just because it's so it's consistently great. And it's got like feel like maybe a little bit more variety too. It's got this like sort of temple of a song that is How Do You Sleep, like a 10-minute masterpiece. And then it's got like this kind of oddly inspirational song Tonight. It's got this sort of introspective title track. It's got this really driving song called I Used To, and this other song that's very hypnotic called Other Voices. So yeah, it's my favorite one, and I think it's one of my favorite albums ever. But I think about I kind of compare LCD Sound System to Guns N' Roses a little bit. I don't think there's been a band since uh, that kind of follows in Guns N' Roses' footsteps. Um, as much as LCD Sound System, they're very different sound, obviously, but it's a band that released like very little music overall, and yet what they did release was such a like a hypersonic strike of condensed genius that they just can't help but rub shoulders with the all-time greats. And for that reason, I always thought it was kind of poetic that they headlined Coachella together in 2016 when both of them were kind of making their comebacks and kind of reminding the players, the musicians of the day, like, hey, this is what it takes to like really get into this is what it really sounds like to be like an all-timer. So yeah, I regret that it took me as long as it did for me to like truly dive in and really get on board with LCD Sound System, but they are easily one of my favorite bands of all time and number 8 on this list. Number 7 is Father John Misty. This is an interesting one because I have actually have not. This is definitely an artist I need to do the give the Coldplay, the Bob Seger, the LCD sound system treatment of going through and really listening to all of his albums. But he's done six, I believe, and I've actually only listened to two of his albums all the way through, which, the fact that he's number seven on this list should tell you about the quality of those two albums. And then it's also kind of an indictment on me for not diving deeper, and also kind of sets the stage for him to rise even farther up this list than he is right now at number seven. Um, so again, like kind of similar to LCD Sound System, my first time listening to an album from him was his 2017 release. I had a lot of car time in 2017, and I had a lot of time to listen to a lot of modern albums. I remember listening to a ton of modern albums in 2017. But that album was called Pure Comedy, and it is a really fascinating minimalist album. It's full of depressing and yet impressively catchy, sort of like warning songs, like Total Entertainment Forever, but sort of like it also has like these shockingly sweet bouts of appreciation, like Smoochie, and then just straight up like long form, gorgeous musical epics like So I'm Growing Old on Magic Mountain. At its core, though, it is very almost oppressively like singular album. Very little variety on it in terms of its music. It's Father John Misty and his ache-fueled vocals, and just kind of his conservative approach to musical accompaniment. A lot of piano, a little bit of acoustic guitar. So this was my only touchstone with him for many years, and so you can imagine my surprise when I was like, okay, I'm going to listen to his 2024 album, Mahash Mashana, and I was exposed to what is truly one of, if not the most musically expansive and variety packed albums I've ever heard. Like, we're talking Beatles White Album level variety packed into this one 9 track LP. It has it all. It's got string laden masterpieces like the title track and this other really eye watering song called Mental Health. It's got Beatles esque swing and weirdness on She Cleans Up. It's got this sort of speaker blowing explosion of a song that is Screamland. It's got In the Pocket Funk on I guess Time Just Makes Fools of Us All. It's got this Lou Reed-esque sort of LCD sound system type song, Josh Tillman and the Accidental Dose. And what's amazing is how well Father John Misty nails every approach. And in a lot of these cases, he's delivering the best versions of each one of these styles that I've ever heard. So Mahash Mashana, not only the greatest album of the decade, I think it's an unmissable musical event, easily among the top 10 greatest albums I've ever heard, probably in the top five greatest albums I've ever heard. Kind of a similar space as Roger Waters' Is This Life You Really Want? And, it leads me to think, man, I can really imagine what he's going to have in store for whatever the follow up to Mahash Mashana is. And more than likely, it's going to be something that nobody expects. So I am just head over heels for Father John Misty, and I can, he has certainly potential to move up on this list if and when I go back and listen to his other albums. Number six, this is going to be a cheesy pick, but if I'm being honest, I got to put Lin-Manuel Miranda at number six. And obviously, if you don't know, he's the musical mind behind Hamilton, the Broadway classic, as well as a lot of other stuff that he's done since then, for various musicals. It's kind of hard to, I think, understate the impact Lin-Manuel Miranda had on the musical landscape with the release of Hamilton in 2015. It just kind of became this musical event that everyone was talking about and nobody could escape, because of the really strong audio version of the show. Even if you weren't able to go to New York and shell out hundreds of dollars to see it, you could listen to the album, which is what I did. And you still kind of got a lot. You didn't get the visuals, but you got a lot of like what made the show great, which was just how strong the music was. And it would be years before I was able to see the show myself, but obviously I have seen it multiple times now, because it's available on Disney Plus. But I remember just listening to that album without visual accompaniment was just this sort of unforgettable experience of impeccable storytelling mixed with very varied and maximalist hip hop, that was unlike anything or probably anyone had ever really heard before. Um, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, he was the composer, he was the show's driving creative force, and he was the lead performer. So obviously it was a star-making work, the likes of which have rarely ever been replicated, prior and certainly never since. His impact on the musical scene was immediate with Hamilton, and then it continued actually surprisingly through that where beyond that where he did some other stuff that was sort of not on the same level but a similar level of like ridiculously huge massively successful tracks. He scored Moana, the Disney film from 2016, which is just filled to the brim with Hamilton-esque nuggets of brilliance, particularly in the beginning of that film. It kind of falls off when The Rock gets in it, but those first couple songs, "Where You Are" and "How Far I'll Go," which are obviously the most popular songs on the album, are just so strong and very, very Hamilton-esque. And what's really interesting is if you want a really clear and just concise explanation of how important Lin-Manuel Miranda is, how good of a songwriter he is, go listen to the soundtrack for 2024's Moana and listen to the exactly zero iconic songs that that album has and compare it to 2016, which is like some of the most iconic Disney songs like ever written. And you could see like just the immediate drop off in quality. Um, and then he kind of demonstrated that again in for We Don't Talk About Bruno from Encanto, which it's not like as good obviously as Hamilton or some of those Moana tracks, but it was like so unbelievably catchy and popular. I heard that song way before I actually saw the movie Encanto, and I feel like there's probably more people that know the song than they know that film, which I think is, just think about that and just think about how great of a songwriter you have to be to be able to accomplish something like that. So uh, there's those three kind of epochal works and obviously dozens of others in between. I really think that he's become maybe the greatest hitmaker of the last decade, other than perhaps someone else that we're going to talk about here shortly, and definitely one of the greatest musical auteurs in the world. So Lin-Manuel Miranda, you're getting your stripes here from Controlled Burns and the soundtrackonline.com, number 6 on this list. Number 5, we have Yasunori Nishiki. And, I was thinking about Yasunori Nishiki, who is a yet another of the all-time great modern composers coming out of Square Enix. And I kind of realized that as I was writing this, I was like, no video game company in the world has worked with a greater litany of composers than Square Enix. And I think it's gotten to the point where they might could be pointed to as the single greatest publisher of music in the world since, the 90s. The studio's output was dominated in the 90s by Nobuo Uematsu, who we may be speaking about shortly, but a number of other phenomenal artists on this list have passed through those doors: Yoko Shimomura, Masayoshi Soken, Tadayoshi Makino, Yasunori Mitsuda, and Mitsuda Suzuki. As great as all those are, I don't think any of them have reached the same highs and the same level of consistent greatness that Yasunori Nishiki did, which is all the more impressive considering that Nishiki has worked almost exclusively on the Octopath Traveler series. And I think Nishiki is probably closer to the beginning of his career than the end of it, which is an amazing thing to think about. It's not a stretch to say that Nishiki's work is critical to those games' appeal, particularly with this his magnum opus, which is the 7+ hour odyssey that is the score for Octopath Traveler 2, which I have listened to in its entirety outside of the away from the game. It's one of my favorite games of all time, but I have sat and listened to the entire album separate from that with no video game accompaniment. And never have I heard that amount of music devoted to a single project that sounds that consistently fantastic. And his work absolutely sings, regardless of whether you're playing the game or not when you listen to it. It's a very varied album. It's got acoustic tragedies, rock opera level grandeurs, operatic nightmares, piano laden etudes. It runs the gamut of what can be achieved with an orchestra of the scale that Nishiki was given to work with by the masters at Square, which is obviously very different than a lot of those other artists that I mentioned earlier. They had a more limited soundscape because they were working on older hardware, but now he's able to use an entire orchestra, and boy does he ever, and he maximizes that orchestra like no one I've ever heard. And now, of course, Octopath Traveler Zero has been newly released, and I haven't had the chance to actually play that game or listen to the soundtrack for it yet. But and he's did some other stuff too, like Grand Blue Fantasy. But the point being, his legend is only going to grow from here, and so he has the potential to move even further up the list, which is crazy to think about, considering he is number 5 already. But at number four, we have Guns N' Roses going back to the hard rock scene. So they're one of the rare artists on this list that I became a fan of them actually before my iPod era. So I did listen to a few music, few artists before then. So that's pre 2009. So before I got that iPod, it would have been not have been a rare sight for me to have my portable CD player with Guns N' Roses' greatest hits firmly lodged inside, particularly because that was about all that my brother and I were allowed to listen to from Guns N' Roses, considering the mature themes of much of the band's work. I remember my stepdad listening to "It's So Easy" one time from Appetite for Destruction and be like, "Nope, you guys aren't ready for this," and that set us back by literally years as we were developing our fandom for this band. But our exposure to the band's music kind of slowly ballooned from the greatest hits to we found like this really weird, clean collection of songs from the Use Your Illusion albums at Walmart. It's like they had taken the clean songs from Use Your Illusion 1 and 2 and put them together onto this weird Frankenstein of an album, which we listened to a lot at the time. And then like when we got access to iTunes, we listened to like the one we were like, okay, well this one doesn't say it's explicit, this one doesn't say it's explicit. So we would like just kind of like cherry pick songs from their albums that were not explicit. And then eventually we just went all in and of course listened to everything countless times. And so it's not a stretch to say that Slash himself was the single biggest influence on my brother Brandon as he learned to play the guitar. And the band just totally recontextualized our understanding of what hard rock could be after growing up with, kind of the older generation of Van Halen, Aerosmith, and The Who. One thing that's really stuck out to me about Guns N' Roses is they're a band that it feels like they can make a song about just about anything that they want to make it about and make it unforgettable. You have like songs about public scrutiny, Get in the Ring, or toxic relationships like Bad Obsession, drugs, Mr. Brownstone, sex, Rocket Queen, heartbreak, November Rain, and regret, Estranged. And all of them are just like all-time classics. And while their number of releases during their peak era between 87 and 93 was low, the sheer amount of great music over the course of those 7 years was almost unprecedented. Very similar to LCD Soundsystem we talked about earlier. And then when Axl Rose finally did return with the much anticipated Chinese Democracy in 2008, most people kind of just wrote it off as like this overproduced diary of a madman. And, I don't necessarily disagree with that diagnosis, but it has actually come to become perhaps my favorite of all of the Guns N' Roses releases, just given its dark subject matter and fascinatingly grandiose production and just expansion of what the band could be. And my favorite Guns N' Roses track today is Chinese Democracy's title track. Now, keep in mind, this is not something that when I first heard it, I hated it like everybody else, that album. But it was just a grower for me. It was an acquired taste, and it was a taste that I acquired uh, very deeply. And I just love that. I love almost every song on the album, but the title track in particular is my favorite, I think, of all of Guns N' Roses' work. It's just a supercharged anti-fascist album fueled by no less than five guitarists, multi-layered vocals, a shockingly catchy hook. It's just got it all. And what's really cool is that the reunited version of the band with Slash, Duff, and Axl will still play it and other tracks from Chinese Democracy to this day, which provides fascinating insights into what these songs may have sounded like under the original lineup that the members had they been able to work out the differences at the time. I really wish they would have recorded a live album from that when they first that reunion tour. It's crazy that they didn't, but I would have really loved to be able to have those, just on the go whenever I want on Spotify. But alas, that has not happened. But I think, sort of wrapping up my thoughts here on Guns N' Roses, I think maybe the most impressive thing about them to me has been their staying power with me. It's a band that I've been listening to for well over a decade and a half at this point. And other artists that I listened to at that period, like kind of the CD period of my life, if you will, like Aerosmith and Kiss and The Who and Van Halen and Michael Jackson, they have faded for me to various degrees over the years. Some of them are still obviously on the list, but none of them are anywhere near as high as they would have been, at my peak fandom of them, 15 years ago. But my love and appreciation of Guns N' Roses over the course of that entire time has only strengthened. And so they are number four on this list. Very tough to beat. One person that beats him, number three, is here it is, the woman you've all been waiting for. It's Taylor Swift at number three. So, like I mentioned, few other artists have managed longer trajectories in my musical repertoire than Guns N' Roses, but Taylor Swift is in that rare airspace. Part of that was just a factor of place and time. I mentioned that during my youngest years, I was exposed to her through my dad, who was just well versed in the top country hits of the mid 2000s, and obviously Taylor Swift was entrenched in that from their first two albums. Here, I heard a lot of songs like "Teardrops on My Guitar" and "Love Story" and "White Horse" and "You Belong with Me" regularly, kind of on that radio airplay. And I was really drawn to her a lot more than any of the other artists that he was listening to at that time. And I think part of that was bolstered by the fact that we were both teenagers. But she also had a knack for writing songs that, teenagers like me and kids and adults could all sort of relate to and invest in. Now, I think that if she would have stayed in that lane for her entire career, she would have faded away for me like many of the other artists that I listened to in my teenage years did, that I mentioned earlier. But it said she and her music really grew along with me. And I think a lot of her fans feel similarly. Starting with 2010's Speak Now, which I still think stands actually her greatest work to date. And then maturing even further into Red, which was the double LP in 2012. And with both of those albums, she was kind of further distancing herself from the country roots that she sort of set in her first album and second album. But she really fully stripped herself of that identity with 2014's 1989. And I'll never forget, actually I was in college at that time, just listening to that sort of disco pop opening hook of Welcome to New York, which just really was a herald to the start of an entire new stretch of her career. It was a really electrifying musical moment that is really not unlike Radiohead's transition from OK Computer to the sound that they went with Kid A at the turn of the century. That said, Reputation, the album she did after that, was kind of the first chink in Swift's armor for me. It kind of felt like it was chasing trends more than setting them, although it was armed with one of her greatest songs to date, and then Getaway Car. So, you didn't come away empty-handed listening to that one. But I remember feeling kind of concerned that Lover, which she did in 2019, would kind of be a further decline, especially when it launched with that horrendous single "Me" with that moron Brendan Urie from Panic at the Disco. But weirdly, that was like this odd hiccup compared to the resounding strength of the rest of that album, which is led by her most popular song to date, Cruel Summer, which clearly should have been the lead single from the start, and the emotionally resonant Cornelia Street, which is my favorite song on the album. I don't think anybody could have predicted the kind of stripped down sound that Swift went to next with Folklore and Evermore, which, were very perfect, kind of perfectly COVID era albums. Like people were kind of in the doldrums in 2020 and early 2021, and it really sort of hit that mind space very well. And that was also around the time when that marked the beginning of her re-recordings of previous albums to kind of reclaim them from Scooter Braun, who was kind of this uncooperative owner of the masters, although she ultimately did buy them last year. But I don't really think that those re-recordings are necessarily major improvements on the previous works, although I do really like the Fearless one and the Speak Now one and the Red one. I kind of, I generally will probably just listen to the updated versions as opposed to the originals in most of those cases. Although the re-recording of 1989 was notably worse than the original material because it has this really odd treble heavy mix that is nowhere near as good as the original sound. But anyway, going back to like where her main career at this point, other than the re-recordings, was she was. It seemed like every album that she was releasing kind of seemed to grow her fame and legend, and was definitely successfully bridging the gap from obviously her millennial, more longtime listeners to this new Gen Z fan base. And those are the ones that really seem to adore her 2022 release Midnights. And I think it's rare for an artist to grow their fame, especially as famous as she already was before that, as Swift did with that record. It just seemed like it really exploded her popularity to a much higher degree, which is really weird because I think it's easily her worst album to date. It's filled with reputation, even reputation minus, trend chasing, and frankly, some of the worst songwriting of her otherwise sterling career. And again, I was in this situation where I was like, well, maybe this is it. Maybe I've finally grown out of my own Taylor Swift era, considering just my massive disagreement with the critical and commercial success of Midnights. But then she roared back for me with 2024's The Tortured Poets Department, which is led by literally my favorite Taylor Swift song. I remember listening to The Tortured Poets Department and being like, well, I'm going to give it a shot. And track two, it's like, oh yeah, this is like the best song that she's ever done. And I was just like a bolt of lightning for me, and I just couldn't believe it. And so, it's 31 tracks. That is a gigantic album, and it definitely doesn't maintain that level of quality. But there's a lot of really good stuff on Torture Poets Department. And I enjoyed a lot. And then that brings us to The Life of a Showgirl, the divisive album that she released last year. And I've talked about this on a recent episode of the podcast where I was going through and talking about the albums I listened to in 2025. But I think it's a solid album. It's definitely a noticeable step down from the Tortured Poets Department, and it is lacking in true standout songs, which the Tortured Poets Department delivered. But still solid. Ultimately, just looking at her catalog as a whole like this, she's not perfect, right? But I don't think any pop hit maker has managed to stay as relevant and consistently great as she has done over the course of the last 2 decades. Each of her works managed to stand out and I would say largely excel on their own merits as she continues to, again, remake and recontextualize her work for the moment. She's unpredictable, she's smart, she's endearing, and her legend only seems to grow with each release. And, there's really no way to know what she's going to do next, which is a good situation to be in. And I'll always look forward to another Taylor Swift release. So top two now. Number two is Nobuo Uematsu, which should come as no surprise if you know me very well at all. When it comes to varied and unpredictable yet consistently great brilliance, it's really impossible to do better than Squaresoft's seminal composer Nobuo Uematsu, who is of course the famed auteur of the soundscape of the Final Fantasy series during its 90s heyday. No artist I've ever been exposed to has a body of work even near Uematsu's during that run from 1987 to the early 2000s. During that time, he unleashed an unbelievable 15 years of consistently fantastic, groundbreaking music at an alarmingly fast pace. In the late 80s alone, he scored the first two Final Fantasy games, which included literally game-changing works as the series' legendary prelude, the main theme, and the Chocobo theme. In addition to scoring the original Saga title, which was called Final Fantasy Legend here in the U.S. at the time, before that was all before the turn of the decade. So that's just like 87 through 89. Then his pace in the early 90s was equally impressive. He scored no less than four massive works of art for Final Fantasy 3 through 6 in the first 4 years of the decade, before taking his time to deliver perhaps the most iconic musical work in the history of video games, which is Final Fantasy 7. And while not as popular, I would say his work on Final Fantasy VIII was even surpassed the work that he did on Final Fantasy VII. Um, and then of course he put a bow on his this great run with the nostalgically fueled Final Fantasy IX. And the fact that he did Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX with just 1 year in between them is just unbelievable. And I don't think naming those works is enough to fully contextualize the scope of his work during that time. The original Final Fantasy score, it consisted of 20 tracks, right? Pretty tame. Final Fantasy 3, just 2 years later, had doubled that to 44. It leapt to 60 plus in Final Fantasy 5, 85 in Final Fantasy 7. And by the time he got to Final Fantasy 9, it was 110 tracks on that album, just that album alone. And the variety on display across that work is equally impressive, just as impressive as the scope. I mean, listen to the bass heavy groove of Final Fantasy VII's The Oppressed. Compare that to like the demented operatic grandeur of Final Fantasy VI's Dancing Mad, or the calm acoustic tones of Final Fantasy VIII's Breezy. These tracks are all wildly different, but they all kind of include the slightly off-kilter, unique charm that Uematsu managed to bring to all of his work, regardless of the instrumentation. And that really shines when listening to his earliest work on the first three Final Fantasies through a fully orchestrated lens, which is a task made beautifully easy thanks to the Distant World series of albums. Take a listen to the original works compared to the fully orchestrated medley found on the first Distant Worlds album from 2007. And, you discover for yourself the truly classical chops driving Uematsu's work on the limited sound chip of the NES, compared to what it sounds like with that full orchestra behind it. It's really amazing to hear how much of that, classical sound was driving his work, and it's really cool to be able to hear it in that context. Uematsu largely retired from full-time composition following Final Fantasy IX, but he continued to lead major works like Blue Dragon and Lost Odyssey in the 2000s, while still delivering some of the most memorable music from other releases, including Final Fantasy X to Xanarkand, Final Fantasy XII's Kiss Me Goodbye, and then even Super Smash Bros. Legendary main theme in 2008. That was cool. And then into the 2010s and beyond, he still continued to release great music. He's done selections from Final Fantasy XIV. He did The Last Story, Fantasy Life, Grand Blue Fantasy. And then, of course, his music is being further immortalized now through the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. and alongside the work of phenomenal arrangers and some of those, uh, I guess, collaborators that we've talked about early on this list, as well as arrangers like TPR and Melandrew and people, other people that we discuss here on the top 100. So now presiding over a 40-year body of work, I think that Uematsu stands tall as not only the greatest composer of our modern age, but one of the most versatile, unpredictable, and just consistently phenomenal musical artists of all time. So that's Nobuo Uematsu, and that leaves just one entry. My vote for the greatest artist of all time. And again, if you know me very well, this should come as no surprise. My number one on this list is Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. Um, for many of the artists on this list, the difference between one place versus another is just kind of a hair's breadth. I mean, I've spent countless hours tinkering with this list and moving some of the mid-tier artists around long after I finished my initial version. We've talked about that on the podcast here today. But the degree to which Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band is my number one could not be wider. I mean, I have this kind of complex math-based formula that I use to determine placement for artists on the list. Um, Springsteen and the E Street Band outpaced Nobuo Uematsu by a ratio of nearly 3-1. So, and you just heard me gush about Nobuo Uematsu for about 5 minutes. His dominance on my musical life is absolute, and it is virtually impossible to fathom a different artist rising to take his place. One thing that unites many of the pop artists on this list, or the top artists on this list, is the appreciation for their full body of work, right? But no artist in history has had a body as lengthy, storied, varied, and brilliant as Bruce Springsteen's. He's a man whose work is so great. He literally just released 7 albums worth of unreleased material last year, more than half a century since the release of his first record, and even that runs circles around a lot of the best works that other great artists have come up with. Uh, the full breadth of Springsteen's catalog is the stuff of legend. His greatest run was definitely his first run in the 1970s with the release of 4 truly brilliant albums over the course of that time that kind of merged the grandiose maximalist sensibilities of the E Street Band with the greatest songwriter that has walked the earth. It took until 1975's Born to Run, which is his third album, for Springsteen to really break through to the mainstream, and then all the way until 1984's Born in the USA for him to be regarded as the legend that he always was. But his career was off to an immediately phenomenal start with 1973's dual releases, Greetings from Asbury Park and The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle. I think if any other artist like ever had released 2 albums of even the same quality as those 2 albums over the course of a decade, much less a single year, they would probably be a shoe-in for the top 10 on this list, if not the top 5. The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle in particular is so packed to the brim with all-timers. It's almost mind-boggling to imagine that Springsteen was able to top it, but he did twice in the same decade, first with 1975's triumphant Born to Run, and again with 1978's darker, more varied, and even better Darkness on the Edge of Town. And these 3 albums alone constitute my top 3 albums from anyone ever. Wild Innocent and E Street Shuffle has Incident on 57th Street, New York City and Serenade. Greatest songwriting I've ever been exposed to was on Born to Run with Thunder Road, Backstreets, Jungle Land. And the Darkness of the Edge of Town's just shockingly powerful lineup of tracks like Something in the Night, Racing in the Street, The Promised Land. I mean, all these songs are easily not only among the top 500, these are among the top 50 songs that I've ever heard. And I think would be held up as pretty much any other artist's greatest triumphs, but he's just got like a laundry list of them. And what's crazy about that is on these albums they've been overshadowed by bigger hits like Rosalita and Born to Run and Badlands, which are of course all legendary songs in their own right. And so, no other run of Springsteen's career, I think, can match the quality of his output in the 70s. I will be honest about that. But the quantity soared in the 80s without a notable hit to the quality across such masterworks as the expansive The River, the pared back and somber Nebraska, obviously the earth shaking Born in the USA, which was his commercial peak, and the understated Tunnel of Love. Um, Now, Springsteen foolishly disbanded the E Street Band for his 90s run, which saw a major commercial and critical decline for him. But he still released a number of gems during that period, like Human Touch's Roll of the Dice and Stranger in Town's Better Days. Not to mention, he released maybe the greatest compilation of unreleased recordings ever compiled with Tracks in 1998, which is a sprawling 4+ hour epic that includes such masterpieces as Thundercrack, Frankie, and Brothers Under the Bridge, which are also incredible. It is legitimately baffling that they didn't find their way onto something before then, right? In other words, he's cut better songs than most people could ever dream of writing. But he reunited the E Street Band in 1999, and that led to maybe the greatest live tour of all time, and then a career rejuvenation that found him as relevant as ever with releases like The Rising, which was inspired by 9/11 in 2002. Magic and Working on a Dream were kind of these sister albums in the late 2000s. And in 2012, he has the politically charged Wrecking Ball, which was also kind of emotionally charged because it was released just after the death of the E Street Band's legendary sax man, Clarence Clemens. But for me, though, it's actually 2020's Letter to You that stands as his greatest work since, his Born in the USA heyday. It's just an epic album that leans on the full power of the E Street Band to deliver a collection of songs that are shocking in both scope and consistent quality. And it's amazing, in particular, when you realize that that was coming from an artist entering his sixth decade of activity when he released that. So, yeah, on that note too, it's impossible to overstate the importance of the E Street Band's musicianship and camaraderie on Springsteen's music. True solo albums that he did like Nebraska, they're beloved, right? But you just can't compare something like Atlantic City and its singular sound to like a 10-minute blowout that is Jungle Land or the power of Backstreets, both from Born to Run. It's just that you just can't replicate that with just with one guy. And I think that it's important to highlight that the E Street Band themselves are so important to what makes him so great. If I separated them out, the E Street Band would still be number two on this list because they're the best band that's ever walked the face of the earth. Um, Great thing about that is that Springsteen has been ridiculously generous with his release of live recordings alongside the E Street Band, which is where he's at his best, which is in a live setting. The giant compilation live album that he did in 1985 is probably the most famous and celebrated example of this, and it is magical, without a doubt. But for my money, it's the recordings of singular shows, like the band's 1975 show at London's Hammersmith Odeon, or the legendary No Nukes concert from 1979, that kind of stand out as the greatest live triumphs of his back catalog. Impressively, E Street Band and its frontmen have stayed just as solid over the course of the all years, all the way to the present day. I saw them for the first time in 2023, and not only was I impressed by their sound and endurance, I really just couldn't believe the expansiveness of their set list, which stretched all the way back to Springsteen's earliest recordings like Kitty's Back, while eschewing classic hits like Born in the USA that probably no other artist would ever consider skipping on a show for the rest of their lives, right? And he did. Springsteen released a compilation record from that tour called Road Diary in 2024. And would you believe if I said it was every bit as good as the Born in the USA tour compilation that released that same year? Honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, but I implore you to listen to both those albums and report back otherwise that there's a drop in quality between the two, even though they were recorded, 40 years apart. So with a body of work matched by only by the quality of his songwriting and incredible musical compositions in the H Street Band, I've only scratched the surface of what I love about Bruce Springsteen through this essay, but hopefully you can at least begin to glean from my words here why I hold him in such high regard as my undisputed pick for the greatest musical artist of all time. So there you have it. After all this time, my top 100 artists is finally complete. It's very satisfying for me to say that, and I really appreciate everybody kind of listening to that if you do, and hopefully it inspires you to listen to be introduced to some great artists or listen, re-examine some artists that maybe you've overlooked. And like I said, you can read the full list on the soundtrackonline.com, and you can just kind of see them with a picture there and everything and kind of a list format that I've laid out for you. So that's it for this big project. Next big project for me in 2026 is going to be my top 500 songs of all time. The list is basically complete. This is the good news, but I've got to like write it up, and obviously we'll be sharing it on the podcast in a massive series. So hopefully you'll look forward to that. And then we'll also continue the series that I have going on with Reagan. Of course, we definitely are going to be discussing A Night of the Seven Kingdoms probably on the next podcast before or I don't even know if that'll even come out before the next episode of the show. But we'll probably just kind of discuss both of them together there. Or we'll figure out what we want to do there, but we'll definitely be talking about that show and sort of updating my Game of Thrones list of my top book characters or Song of Ice and Fire, I guess. And then I'm sure that there will be plenty of other exciting things to get into in the year ahead here on Controlled Burns. In the meantime, remember that you can write into the show at ControlledBurnes with an ES at gmail.com and have your questions and comments read on air. And then if you like the show, please subscribe, follow, like, review wherever you listen to your podcasts. For now, and until next time, keep it warm.